Welcome aboard on the journey of time. Tonight, we'll set sail across another chapter of history. Maybe you're resting in bed, unwinding after a long day, or simply letting the past keep you company for a while. For where are you listening tonight? Feel free to share in the comments. I always love hearing about your corner of the world and the hour that finds you here. If these gentle, slow stories bring you peace and comfort, I'd be truly grateful to have you along here and subscribe. Now, let's begin our story. In the age of sail, when the world was being carved into colonies and trade routes, there remained a blank space. Not a vast continent, but a single, stubborn speck in the trackless void of the South Atlantic. On the charts, it was marked as Tristan de Cunha, named for the Portuguese admiral who first sighted its volcanic peak in 1506. But for centuries, it was less a place and more a warning, a grim, cloud-wreathed pinnacle of rock, lashed by the roaring forties, a landfall of last resort for the desperate and the shipwrecked. It was the utmost the place the world forgot. And yet, a handful of people, cast together by the turbulent currents of history, would choose to call it home. This is their story. The storm had been a living entity, a mindless, screaming fury that had harried the Blendworth for 3 days. A British merchant ship bound for the Cape. She was now a broken toy in the hands of giants. Her masts were splintered stumps, her sails shredded streamers, and the sea poured into her hold with a voracious hunger. Captain John Glass, his face a mask of salt and exhaustion, clung to the wheel, his knuckles white. The world was a chaos of towering gray waves and stinging spray. The barometer had plummeted to a reading he had never seen before. Land, dead ahead. The lookout's cry was a shriek of terror, not relief. Through the ragged curtains of rain and spume, a monstrous shape materialized. It was not a gentle shore, but a sheer, black cliff face, rising into the low, racing clouds. It was the edge of the world. A wave, larger than any before, lifted the Blendworth like a child's boat and threw her forward. There was a sound like the earth cracking, the agonized groan of timber being ground against rock. The shock threw Glass from his feet. He came to, half drowned, lying on a shelf of sharp, volcanic rock. The air was thick with the smell of salt, crushed seaweed, and a strange, earthy dampness. The storm's fury was abating, replaced by the relentless, booming crash of surf on the unforgiving coast. He pushed himself up, his body one solid bruise. The Blendworth was gone, swallowed by the sea. Around him, scattered like driftwood, were a few dozen of his crew. Some moved, others did not. They were alive, but the word felt hollow. They were alive on a rock in the middle of an ocean thousands of miles from anywhere. As the mist lifted slightly, Glass took stock of their prison. It was a scene of sublime, terrifying desolation. The island was a fortress, its basalt walls plunging into a churning, white-frothed sea. Above, the land rose steeply, cloaked in a strange, tussocky grass and dense, wet fern. The only sound, besides the sea, was the forlorn cry of seabirds, thousands upon thousands of them, nesting on every available ledge. They were the true inhabitants of this place. The survivors, 28 men in all, huddled in a shallow cave, shivering in their wet clothes. Their faces were etched with a shock so profound it was beyond fear. They were merchants, sailors, boys from London and Edinburgh. This was not a place for them. "We'll die here," a young carpenter's mate named Thomas mumbled, his teeth chattering. "We'll starve or freeze." Glass, feeling the weight of command settle on him like a lead cloak, stood. He was a practical man, a Scot with little patience for despair. "We'll not die today, he said, his voice rough but firm. "The sea did not take us, so we will not give ourselves to it. We have hands. We have wits. We will find water. We will find food." The first order of business was survival. They found a stream of fresh, cold water cascading down from the high plateau. It was the island's first gift. Then, they discovered the island's larder. The beaches were littered with driftwood, and the rocky shoreline was crusted with mussels. But the real bounty was the birds. The Tristan albatross, unafraid of man, sat on their nests, allowing the men to simply walk up and take them. The eggs were plentiful. It was a brutal, necessary slaughter. They ate the birds roasted over fires of damp driftwood, the greasy, rich meat, a life-saving sustenance. Days turned into weeks. They built more substantial shelters from stone and turf, their shapes low and hunched against the constant wind. They explored their tiny domain, a mere 11 miles across at its widest. They found a more sheltered area on the northwest coast, a small plateau they named the settlement plain. It was here, looking out at the immense, empty horizon, that Glass made a decision. A ship, a whaler out of New London, eventually sighted their smoke signals. It stood off the coast, and a boat was lowered. The captain, a grizzled American, offered to take them off. "This is no place for men," the American said, his eyes scanning the stark landscape. "Cool, mate. We'll take you to the Cape." Glass looked at his men. He saw the longing in their eyes for tobacco, for bread, for the company of women, for the known world. But he also saw something else. They had carved a life from this rock. However meager, it was theirs. To leave was to return to being nothing, a destitute sailor in a foreign port. Here they were founders. He turned to the American captain. "We thank you, sir, but we will stay." A murmur ran through his men. Some were aghast. Others, the more resilient, nodded slowly. The American shook his head in disbelief, left them with a few precious supplies, a bag of seed potatoes, some tools, a Bible, and sailed away, his ship shrinking to a speck on the vast, gray canvas of the ocean. John Glass stood on the beach, watching it go. The feeling was not of being abandoned, but of a door closing and a new, terrifying, and utterly singular world opening up. They were no longer castaways. They were settlers. The history of Tristan to Cunha had begun. The departure of the whaler left a silence that was more profound than any storm. The world had receded, leaving them alone with the wind, the birds, and the crushing immensity of the sea. The 28 men were a microcosm of humanity, stranded on their own personal moon. The initial struggle for basic survival now gave way to the more complex challenge of building a society from scratch. Captain Glass, by sheer force of will and the natural authority of his former rank, became their de facto governor. He was not a tyrant, but a pragmatist. His first decree was simple and absolute. There would be no hoarding, no idleness, and no conflict over women, for there were none. Their community would be a brotherhood of necessity. The settlement plain became their canvas. Using stone axes fashioned from the hard, local rock and tools salvaged from the Blenworth, they began the backbreaking work of building a permanent village. The architecture was dictated by the environment. The houses, which they called stone cottages, were low, single-room structures with walls 2 feet thick, built from the dark, volcanic rock that littered the ground. The roofs were framed with driftwood beams and thatched with a long, tough tussock grass, weighted down with ropes of twisted grass against the gales that screamed down from the 6,760-foot peak they called simply the mountain. The interior of each cottage was a world of dim, earthy smells. The floor was packed earth, a small, Stone hearth provided heat and a means of cooking, the smoke seeping out through a hole in the roof. The light came from a single, small window, often just a piece of greased animal bladder stretched over a frame, casting a weak, amber glow. The furniture was crude sleeping platforms built into the walls, covered in dried grass and sealskins. It was a life reduced to its essentials, a deliberate retreat from the complexity of the 19th century. The social structure was equally elemental. Glass established a system of communal labor. Each man had his task. The best fishermen, like the Italian seaman Gaetano Lavarello, took charge of the boats, braving the treacherous surf to harvest the rich stocks of crayfish and fish from the cold waters. Others tended the small, walled gardens they had managed to cultivate on the fertile volcanic soil, where the precious seed potatoes from the American whaler had taken root, alongside a few hardy vegetables. The most important task, however, was the annual harvest of the birds. This was the true cornerstone of their survival. Every southern spring, the men would undertake the birding. They would climb the steep, slippery slopes to the high cliffs where millions of seabirds, albatross, petrels, penguins nested. It was dangerous, grueling work. Using long poles with nooses, they would catch the birds or simply take them from their nests. The slaughter was immense but ritualistic. Nothing was wasted. The meat was salted and dried, becoming their primary protein for the year. The feathers were saved for bedding, the fat rendered for oil for their lamps. The birding was not a hunt. It was a harvest as vital as the potato crop. Evenings were spent in the cottages, the wind a constant companion at the door. The men would mend nets, carve whalebone into buttons and tools, and talk. They spoke of the world they had left, their stories becoming polished and mythic with each retelling. They read and reread the single Bible until its pages were soft as cloth, its stories merging with their own. They were creating a shared past, a foundation myth for their tiny nation. One evening, as they sat around a peat fire, a young sailor named Peter Green looked up from whittling a piece of driftwood. "Captain," he said, his voice thoughtful, do you suppose anyone in London remembers we're here?" Glass puffed on his pipe, the smell of the local peat a pungent, earthy perfume. "It does not matter, Peter," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "We remember who we are. We are the people of Tristan. That is enough." In that moment, the isolation was no longer a prison sentence. It had become an identity. They were no longer British or Italian or Dutch. They were Tristanians. The founding stone of their society was not laid in ceremony, but in the daily, unglamorous acts of building a wall, planting a potato, and sharing a meal in a small, smoky room at the edge of the world. They had turned their back on the globe, and in doing so, had created a world of their own. The 5th year on the island was the hardest. The initial novelty of survival had worn off, replaced by a grinding, monotonous reality. The brotherhood of castaways began to show its cracks. Men who had worked side by side in harmony now bickered over the most trivial matters, the allocation of a better sealskin, a perceived slight during the birding. A deep, unspoken melancholy settled over the settlement. The island, for all its bounty, was missing its heart. It was a society of ghosts, echoing with the laughter and voices that were not there. The change came on the wings of a dream. One of the men, a quiet Dane named Anders, had been feverish for days. When he recovered, he spoke of a vivid vision, a ship, not of rescue, but of replenishment, arriving with figures in bright dresses, their faces soft and smiling. He spoke of it with such conviction that it spread through the small community like a fever of hope. Captain Glass, a man of facts, dismissed it as delirium. But he too felt the void. He began to write a letter. It was a difficult thing to compose, a message in a bottle thrown into the vastness of the British Empire. He described their situation, their loyalty to the crown, and their most pressing need: wives. He entrusted it to the captain of a passing sealing vessel, with a plea to deliver it to the British authorities at the Cape of Good Hope. Months turned into a year. Hope dwindled. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a cry went up from the lookout post. A ship, but this was no whaler or sealer. It was a British naval vessel, HMS Julia, her sails crisp and white, her lines purposeful. A strange excitement, mixed with terror, gripped the settlement. The world was coming to call. The Julia anchored in the often treacherous roadstead. A boat was lowered, and a naval officer, crisp in his uniform, was rowed to the stony beach. With him came 5 women. They stood on the shore, a splash of color against the monochrome landscape of rock and grass. They were not society ladies. They were practical, strong-faced women from the Cape Colony, a mix of English settler stock and mixed-race backgrounds. They had answered an obscure government call for female volunteers of good character to settle on Tristan da Cunha. They had known it was a gamble, a one-way ticket to the unknown. The men of Tristan gathered, their work-roughened hands clasped nervously, their faces a mixture of awe and sheer, unvarnished terror. They had not seen a woman in over 5 years. The leader of the women was a widow named Sarah Jacobs. She was perhaps 30, with eyes that had seen hardship and a posture that spoke of resilience. She looked at the huddled group of men, at their crude stone cottages, at the immense, brooding mountain that dominated the skyline. She saw the poverty, the isolation, but she also saw the neat stone walls, the tended potato patches, the evidence of order and determination. Captain Glass stepped forward, removing his worn cap. "Welcome to Tristan da Cunha, ma'am," he said, his voice uncharacteristically formal. Sarah Jacobs met his gaze. "We have come to stay, Captain," she said, her voice clear and steady over the sound of the surf. The integration was not a fairy tale. It was a difficult, awkward, and profound social revolution. The men, set in their solitary ways, had to learn to share their space, their decisions, their lives. The women, thrown into a primitive existence far harsher than anything they had known at the Cape, had to adapt with incredible speed. Sarah Jacobs and the others immediately set to work, not as delicate flowers, but as partners. They showed the men how to better cure sealskins for softer clothing, how to vary their diet with edible seaweeds and roots they recognized. They brought seeds for flowers, which they planted in tiny, defiant gardens by their cottages. But their most important contribution was the establishment of a future. Within a year, the first Tristanian-born child, a girl named Mary, drew her first breath in a stone cottage. Her cry a new sound on the island, a sound of continuity. The birth was a community event, a symbol of their collective triumph over oblivion. The arrival of the women transformed the settlement from a camp of survivors into a colony of families. The melancholy lifted, replaced by the sounds of children playing and the rhythms of domestic life. The society, once a simple brotherhood, now had the complex, beautiful, and sometimes difficult dynamics of kinship, inheritance, and love. The island was no longer just a refuge. It was a home. The dream of the feverish Dane had come true. The heart had arrived, and Tristan da Cunha began to beat with a new, enduring rhythm. Life on Tristan was not measured by the turning of pages on a calendar, but by the deep, primal rhythms of the land and sea. The year was a wheel of 4 essential seasons, each with its own perils and promises, its own sacred tasks that bound the community together in a chain of mutual dependence. The wheel began with the planting. After the long, gale-lashed winter, a tentative gentleness would settle upon the settlement plain. The air still held a bite, but the sun gained a fragile strength. This was the time of the potato. The entire community, from the oldest grizzled sealer to the youngest child who could carry a single tuber, would descend upon the small, stone-walled patches of cultivated ground. The soil, dark and rich with volcanic ash, was turned with spades forged from the iron of old shipwrecks. The precious seed potatoes, saved from the previous year's harvest and carefully sprouted in dark cottage corners, were cut and laid in the furrows. It was a silent, focused ceremony. Failure was not an option. The potato was their bulwark against starvation, their daily bread. As old William Glass, his back now permanently stooped from a lifetime of labor, placed each piece in the earth, he would murmur a quiet, non-denominational prayer he had crafted himself. Grow straight, grow deep, feed my children. Then came the birding. As the southern spring bloomed in a riot of wildflowers on the higher slopes, the men prepared for the most dangerous work of the year. The air filled with the cacophony of millions of returning seabirds. The Tristan albatross, the great mollyhawks, and the tiny, burrowing petrels reclaimed the island, their sheer numbers a staggering, noisy testament to life. For the Tristanians, they were the harvest. The men, armed with long, supple poles tipped with nooses made from sheep gut, would set out before dawn. It was a pilgrimage to the high, wind-scoured cliffs. The climb was treacherous, up paths known only to them, slick with guano and damp moss. Peter Green, now a man in his prime with a young family, led the parties. He moved with a sure-footed grace, his eyes reading the rock face like a book. The catching was a grim, efficient ballet. The birds, evolutionarily naive to this two-legged predator, would sit on their nests, their dark eyes curious. The noose would slip over their heads, a quick, sharp pull, and it was done. There was no sport, no glory. It was butchery on an industrial scale, a necessary sin for survival. The men worked in silence. The only sounds the shrieking of the birds, the howl of the wind, and the thud of the carcasses hitting the pile. The feathers would fly like snow, sticking to their sweat-dampened clothes and faces. By evening, they would return to the settlement, their backs laden with the season's security, hundreds of birds to be plucked, salted, and dried in the wind. The air in the village would hang thick with the smell of salt, blood, and down for weeks. After the intensity of the birding came the fishing. The sea, their relentless warden, was also their most generous provider. The men would launch their longboats, beautiful, clinker-built vessels crafted from driftwood and wreckage, their design a legacy of 100 forgotten shipwrights. Gaetano Lavarello, his Italian heritage evident in his natural affinity for the water, was the undisputed master of the boats. He could read the mood of the sea in the color of the water and the shape of the swells. They would row out into the cold, clear waters, setting lines for the fat cod and hunting the crayfish that scuttled in the rocky depths. A good catch was a cause for celebration, a break from the monotony of salted bird meat. Finally, there was the waiting. This was the longest season, stretching through the late autumn and winter. It was a time of mending and making. In the dim, peat-fired light of the cottages, the women would weave and knit, turning the coarse wool of their small flock of sheep into socks, jerseys, and caps. The men would carve scrimshaw from whale teeth, repair nets, and tell stories. The wind would scream its fury outside, a constant reminder of their isolation. This was when the gaze of every islander, young and old, would turn most frequently to the empty horizon, searching for a sail. The arrival of a ship was the punctuation in the sentence of their year. It was a frenzy of controlled excitement. The ship would stand off, unable to risk the anchorage, and a boat would be rowed ashore through the surf. It might bring a letter from the outside world, its news years out of date, but devoured nonetheless. It might bring a sack of flour, a precious commodity that meant bread for a few weeks. It might bring a new family, brave or desperate souls adding their thread to the island's tapestry. Or it might bring nothing, a captain too hurried to stop, his passing a fresh lesson in their own insignificance. This was the rhythm of the rock. Plant, bird, fish, wait. It was a cycle that demanded everything from them and gave them just enough in return. It was a life with no surplus, no room for error. But in its stark, unyielding demands, it forged a people of profound practicality, infinite patience, and a quiet, unshakable knowledge that their survival was a collective achievement, a song sung in unison against the immense silence of the sea. The system that governed Tristan da Cunha was not written on parchment or enforced by a police force. It was etched into the collective conscience of its people, a set of unwritten rules as fundamental as the tides. They called it the law of the common. And it was the social engine that prevented their tiny society from fracturing into selfishness and strife. Its cornerstone was the concept of communal property. The land, the most precious resource on their 11-mile-wide kingdom, was owned by no one and everyone. When a young couple married, the community would gather to build them a stone cottage. The men would quarry the rock, the women would thatch the roof, and the plot of land on the settlement plain was allocated by consensus, based on need and fairness, not lineage or wealth. There were no deeds, no surveys. Your right to the land came from your membership in the community. This extended to labor. All work that benefited the whole was done communally. The annual potato planting and harvest were community events. The maintenance of the paths that connected the cottages, the building and repair of the fishing boats, the arduous task of hauling driftwood from the beaches for fuel, these were not individual chores, but shared responsibilities. A man who shirked his duty was not punished by law. He was shamed by the silent disapproval of his neighbors, a social pressure far more powerful than any jail cell. The proceeds of this communal labor were also shared. The catch from a fishing trip was divided equally among all families, regardless of who had manned the boats. The harvest from the birding cliffs was pooled and distributed according to the size of each household. This system ensured that no family, through bad luck or the illness of a breadwinner, would ever starve. The widow and her children ate the same as the strongest fishermen. The governance of this system was a model of simple, direct democracy. There was no mayor or council. Instead, the community would gather for a meeting whenever a decision needed to be made, whether to accept a new settler, how to use a windfall of timber from a wreck, or to settle a dispute between neighbors. The meetings were held in the largest building, which served as a church and hall. The leader was the chief, a title that held no hereditary power. The chief, often a man like Peter Green who had earned respect through wisdom and fairness, was more of a moderator than a ruler. His role was to facilitate discussion and help the community find a consensus. Everyone had a voice, from the oldest sealer to the youngest man who had just come of age. Debates could be long and passionate, but the goal was always agreement, not victory. This was vividly illustrated when a dispute arose between two brothers over the inheritance of their father's prized possession, a beautifully crafted chest made from the wood of the Blendworth. The brothers, both stubborn, argued fiercely. It threatened to poison their relationship and create a rift in the small community. A meeting was called. The brothers stated their cases. The community listened. Then others spoke. They reminded the brothers of their father's character, of the importance of family, of the pettiness of the argument in the face of their shared struggle for survival. Old William Glass, his voice thin but clear, said, "That chest did not keep your father warm, nor did it fill his belly. It was a pretty thing. Do not let a pretty thing break what is truly strong." The brothers were shamed, not by the words, but by the collective gaze of their community, their extended family. They left the meeting and, without another word, agreed to share the chest, keeping it in one home for a year, then the other. The law of the common had worked. It had used the powerful tools of shared responsibility and social pressure to maintain harmony. This system created a society that was remarkably egalitarian. There were no rich and no poor. There was only us. The measure of a man was not his possessions, but his character, his willingness to work, and his loyalty to the community. The law of the common was their constitution, their social safety net, and their moral compass. It was the ingenious social technology that allowed this handful of people to not just survive, but to thrive in the world's most remote community, proving that the strongest government is sometimes the one that governs least and loves most. Isolation was not just a geographical fact for the people of Tristan. It was the very air they breathed, a tangible presence that shaped their thoughts, their language, and their souls. The vast, empty circle of the horizon was a wall, and the rare ship that pierced it was a messenger from another universe, a world in a bottle tossed onto their shore. The arrival of a vessel was an event that stopped time. The cry "Sail ho!" would echo through the settlement, and every activity would cease. Men would drop their tools, women would abandon their washing, children would stop their games. All would rush to the highest point on the settlement plain, a place they called Lookout Hill, their hands shielding their eyes against the glare of the sea. The mood was a complex cocktail of excitement, trepidation, and profound vulnerability. A ship could mean a letter. The post, when it came, was a ritual. The island's elected chief would take possession of the mailbag, and the entire community would gather in the meeting hall. He would call out the names one by one. To receive a letter was a moment of intense, private joy or sorrow, a connection to a life that felt like a dream. For those who received nothing, it was a quiet, personal grief. The letters, often years out of date, were read and reread until the paper grew soft, the words memorized, the news absorbed into the island's own slowly evolving story. But the ship also brought the outside, and the outside was not always kind. Along with sacks of flour and precious rolls of cloth, it could bring sickness. The common cold, a minor inconvenience in a populated world, could sweep through the isolated community with the force of a plague, striking down the young and the old who had no immunity. The measles, brought by a child on a visiting whaler in the 1880s, ravaged the island, leaving a generation of graves in the small, windswept cemetery. The islanders learned to fear the very contact they craved. The most profound impact was on their culture. Cut off from the linguistic currents of the world, the Tristanians developed a dialect unique on Earth. It was a living fossil, a time capsule of early 19th century English, peppered with words from the original settlers' Dutch, Italian, and Scottish tongues. They dropped their H's and used archaic pronunciations. A child was a titty, a porch a stoop, and they used thou and thee long after it had vanished from common usage elsewhere. It was a language of their own, a verbal fortress that reinforced their separation and their collective identity. The ships also brought news of a world convulsing with changed news of the American Civil War, of the Boer War, of the rise and fall of empires. To the Tristanians, these events were like storms on a distant star. They listened with polite interest, but the news had no bearing on the pressing realities of planting potatoes or repairing a roof. Their world was the rock. Its weather, its harvests, its internal social dynamics. This was the news that truly mattered. One day, a scientific expedition landed. Men with spectacles and notebooks who marveled at the island's unique flora and fauna and the quaint ways of its people. They treated the Tristanians as specimens, a living museum exhibit. Peter Green, now the respected chief, hosted them with customary grace, but he felt a strange unease. He saw the way they looked at his community, with a mixture of pity and anthropological curiosity. That evening, he stood with his son, young John, named for the founder. They watched the expedition's ship, a sleek, steam-assisted vessel, disappear over the horizon, much faster than the sailing ships of old. "They live in a different world, Father," young John said, a hint of longing in his voice. "A world of machines and cities." "Aye," Peter replied, his gaze fixed on the empty sea. "But do not be too quick to envy their world, son. They have many things, but I wonder if they have what we have. They are 1,000 points of light, scattered and alone in their crowds. We are one fire burning together. Our world is small, but it is whole." The ship was gone. The brief, disorienting window to the outside was closed. The Tristanians turned back to their cottages, their gardens, their rhythms. The world in the bottle had been opened, its contents examined, and the bottle had been set adrift again. They were alone once more, their isolation both a prison and a sanctuary, the defining feature of their unique and enduring civilization. The storm that brought the Mabel Clark was one for the legends. It wasn't the brief, violent squall they were used to, but a slow, building fury that gathered for days, the barometric pressure dropping like a stone in a well. The sea, usually a regimented march of gray swells, became a chaotic, heaving madness of cross-chop and towering waves that exploded against the cliffs with a sound like continuous cannon fire. No boat could be launched. The settlement hunkered down in their stone cottages, the peat fires struggling against the damp chill that seeped through the thick walls. It was young Tommy Rogers, braving the gale to check on the sheep in their stone-walled folds, who saw it first. A shape, wrong and broken, in the churning cauldron of the bay they called Calshot Harbor. It was a ship driven onto the submerged rocks, her masts gone, her hull being systematically pounded to splinters by the relentless sea. "Wreck! A wreck!" he screamed, his voice torn away by the wind as he stumbled back into the village. The news acted like a lightning strike. The law of the common, which governed their peaceful daily life, had an unspoken, darker counterpart, the law of the wreck. The sea gave, and the sea took away. And when it gave a wreck, it was a gift of unimaginable wealth: timber, iron, cordage, canvas, and the mysterious, often luxurious, contents of its hold. A fierce debate erupted instantly in the Green family cottage, the wind howling a dissonant chorus to their argument. "We must help them." Sarah Green, Peter's wife, insisted, her face pale. "There will be men out there drowning." Her son, John, now a young man of 20 with a pragmatic streak, shook his head. "It's the Mabel Clark, mother. From the look of her, she's been on the rocks for hours. In this sea," he didn't finish the sentence. The grim reality hung in the air. Survival was unlikely. The surf is a killer. To launch a boat now is to sign our own death warrants. We wait for the storm to break. Peter Green listened, his face a mask of conflicting duties. He was chief, His first responsibility was to his people. Sending men to almost certain death for a faint hope was a burden he couldn't bear. But the thought of sailors, mere hundreds of yards away, perishing while they did nothing, was a moral agony. The storm raged through the night. At first light, it had diminished from a scream to a roar. Peter gave the order. Every able-bodied man, including John and a reluctant but determined Tommy, launched the two strongest longboats. The water was still a terrifying maelstrom of confused currents and debris. They rowed with a desperate strength, their muscles burning, their eyes fixed on the wreck. What they found was a scene of utter devastation. The Mabel Clark was a skeleton, her back broken, her deck house gone. There were no survivors. The only signs of the crew were a few pieces of splintered lifeboat and a single, waterlogged seaman's chest that washed ashore as they watched. The sea had taken its tribute. A solemn silence fell over the men. They rowed back to shore, the excitement of the wreck now tempered by the sobering reality of death. But as the sea calmed further, the practical reality set in. The shoreline for miles was littered with a king's ransom. Great bulks of seasoned Oregon pine, sacks of flour that had swelled and burst, barrels of nails, rolls of pristine canvas, and crates of manufactured goods from a world they barely knew. The harvest began. It was back-breaking, dangerous work. Men waded into the freezing, surging water to secure timbers before they were lost. They used block and tackle to haul immense loads above the high tide line. The entire community was involved. The women and children sorted the salvage, their exclamations echoing across the beach as they discovered treasures. Bolts of colorful calico, a crate of iron cooking pots, a case of mismatched shoes, and, most miraculously, several undamaged axes and saws. That evening, the meeting was charged with a new energy. The tragedy was acknowledged. A prayer was said for the lost crew. But then, the distribution began. Under Peter's guidance, the law of the common was applied with scrupulous fairness. The timber was stacked in a communal pile to be used for new boats and cottage repairs. The nails were counted and divided by household. The flour, though ruined, was salvaged where possible. The calico was measured and allotted by the yard, bringing a splash of color to drab wardrobes for the first time in years. John Green, holding a new, sharp-toothed saw, felt a thrill. This tool would transform their woodworking. But he also looked at the waterlogged seaman's chest, which had been set aside respectfully. It contained a few personal effects: a daguerreotype of a smiling woman, a lock of hair, a water-stained Bible. It was a poignant reminder that their windfall was another man's catastrophe. The wreck of the Mabel Clark was a turning point. It brought them wealth that would ease their lives for a generation, but it also deepened their understanding of their place in the world. They were not just survivors on a rock. They were the beneficiaries of the sea's terrible mercy, the involuntary inheritors of the dreams and destinies of those who failed to pass their shores. The bounty on the beach was a gift, but it was wrapped in the somber cloth of mortality, a lesson they would not forget. The community that had grown from the original castaways was no longer a collection of individuals, but a sprawling, intricate family tree, its branches intertwined through generations of marriage on the small island. The surnames Glass, Green, Hagen, Lavarello, and Rogers were now the pillars of Tristan society. With this deep-rooted kinship came a new kind of pain, one that their isolation magnified 100-fold: the pain of loss. The island's cemetery was a small, fenced plot on a rise overlooking the sea, a place of windswept grass and simple, upright stones carved with names and dates. The tolling of the stone bell, a slab of basalt hung by ropes outside the meeting hall, was a sound that struck dread into every heart. It meant a life had ended. The first great test of their collective spirit came with the passing of William Glass. The patriarch, the founder, the man whose stubborn will had forged their home, finally succumbed to age, his body worn out by a lifetime of labor. His death was not a surprise, but it was a seismic event. He was the last living link to the world before Tristan, to the story of the Blenworth. The entire island gathered for his funeral. It was a raw, blustery day, the sky the color of lead. There were no professional mourners, no elaborate eulogies. The people simply stood together in the wind, a solid mass of humanity against the elements. Peter Green, as chief, spoke a few simple words. He saw a rock, and he made it a home, Peter said, his voice steady though his eyes were red-rimmed. He asked for nothing from the world, and he gave us everything. We are his legacy. As William's body was lowered into the volcanic earth, a collective sorrow, heavy and silent, settled over the community. He was their Adam. His passing felt like the end of their creation story. But loss was not reserved for the old. A year later, a fishing accident claimed the lives of two brothers, Michael and David Hagen. Their boat, the Sea Spray, was caught in a sudden, freak wave off the coast of Nightingale Island. It capsized, and though the other men in the boat were saved, the brothers were swept away. Their bodies were never recovered. The tragedy was paralyzing. The Hagens were a large, central family. The two brothers had been in the prime of their lives, one newly married, the other engaged. The sound of the women's grief, the keening that came from the Hagen cottage, was a raw, animal sound of pain that seemed to tear the very air. The stone bell tolled for 2 days. In a community so small, every death was a personal amputation. There was no anonymity in grief. The entire social fabric was rent. Who would now help old man Lavarello with his roof? Who would take the Hagen parents' place in the potato harvest? The practical questions were as painful as the emotional ones. Yet, it was in these moments of profound sorrow that the law of the common revealed its deepest strength. It was not just a system for sharing potatoes. It was a covenant of shared grief. No one was left to mourn alone. The women of the settlement took turns sitting with the Hagen family, cooking for them, tending the hearth, holding their hands in silence. The men, without being asked, took over the Hagen family share of the communal work, mending their nets, tending their potato patch, caring for their sheep. The community absorbed the shock, distributing the weight of the loss so that no one family would be crushed by it. A week after the brothers were lost, Peter Green stood before the community in the meeting hall. The atmosphere was thick with sadness. "We have lost 2 of our sons," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The sea, which feeds us, has also taken from us. We cannot bring them back, but we can carry their memory. We can carry their parents. We can carry each other. That is who we are." He proposed that the next boat they built, a new, larger longboat made from the timber of the Mabel Clark, be named the Michael and David. It was a simple, powerful act of remembrance. The community agreed, unanimously. The stone bell's toll was the saddest sound on Tristan to Cunha. But the silence that followed, it was never empty. It was filled with the quiet, determined sounds of a community healing itself, the sound of a neighbor splitting wood for a grieving family, the sound of shared meals, the sound of a new boat being built, its name a promise to the future and a tribute to the past. Their isolation made their grief sharper, but their unity made it bearable. The Windward was not a whaler or a trader, but a sleek steam yacht, a creature of elegance and purpose that looked utterly alien in the rugged waters of Tristan. It dropped anchor with a confidence the sailing ships lacked, and a single boat was rowed to shore. The man who stepped onto the beach was unlike any they had seen. He was tall, dressed in a suit of fine wool, and carried an air of authority that was neither naval nor commercial. His name was Mr. Arthur Biddle, and he represented a syndicate of businessmen from Cape Town. He was received with the customary Tristanian hospitality, but a wariness hung in the air. Strangers were rare, and strangers with an agenda were rarer still. Peter Green, his hair now fully gray, hosted him in his cottage, offering tea sweetened with precious sugar. "Mr. Green," Biddle began, his voice smooth and persuasive, "my associates and I have been following the story of your community with great interest. Your resilience is remarkable." "We manage," Peter replied, his tone neutral. "Indeed you do, but we believe we can help you do more than just manage." Biddle leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "We propose a partnership. The waters around your islands are teeming with crayfish, a delicacy in the United States. We will provide everything: a proper fishing vessel, processing equipment, barrels, salt. You provide the labor. We will build a cannery right here. Every man on this island could become prosperous." The words hung in the smoky air. Prosperous. It was a concept as foreign as the steam yacht in their harbor. They knew poverty and they knew sufficiency. But wealth? It was a phantom. A community meeting was called. Biddle presented his plan with polished flair. He painted a picture of a transformed Tristan, of new houses with glass windows, of a proper school, of a steady supply of goods from the outside world. He spoke of money, of salaries that could buy anything they desired. The reaction was divided, deeply and emotionally. The younger men, like John Green and Tommy Rogers, were electrified. They saw a future beyond subsistence, a chance to engage with the world on their own terms. They saw the end of their crushing dependency on passing ships. But at what cost? Argued old Gaetano Lavarello, his voice raspy. They do not want to help us. They want our fish. They will bring their boat, their men, their rules. This cannery will become the master, and we will become its servants. We will forget how to be Tristanians. We will become wage slaves on our own island. The debate raged for days. It was the first time the fundamental tenets of the law of the common had been seriously challenged. The promise of individual wealth threatened to unravel 2 generations of communal living. Peter Green listened to it all, his heart heavy. He saw the longing in his son's eyes and the fear in the eyes of the elders. He saw the shadow the stranger cast, not just the shadow of a man, but the shadow of the modern world, with all its seductive promises and hidden perils. Finally, he stood to speak in the crowded meeting hall. The room fell silent. "Mr. Biddle offers us a new kind of life," Peter began, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his people. "A life of ease and plenty. He offers to take the danger from our fishing and replace it with a wage. It is a powerful offer." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "But I ask you this," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "What is the price of this plenty? Our life is hard, yes, but it is ours. We answer to the sea, to the weather, to each other. If we say yes to this man, who will we answer to then? A company in Cape Town? Will we meet to decide when to fish, or will a factory whistle tell us? Will we share our catch as brothers, or will we hoard our pay?" He looked at Mr. Biddle, who sat with a polite, impatient smile. "We thank you for your offer, sir, but our wealth is not in the sea's crayfish. Our wealth is in this." He gestured to the people around him. "In our community, in our freedom. We will not sell it for a few pots and a salary." The decision was made. The community, after a painful struggle, had chosen tradition over temptation. Mr. Biddle was courteously seen off, his plans in tatters. The steam yacht departed, leaving behind a community that was shaken but united. They had looked into the abyss of change and had chosen to remain themselves. The stranger's shadow had passed, but had left a permanent mark. They now knew that their isolation was not just a geographical fact, but a conscious choice, a fragile thing that required constant vigilance to protect. The world wanted what they had, and they had just fought the first quiet battle to keep it. For weeks, it was a subtle nuisance, a topic of conversation over the evening peat fire. A faint trembling, like a giant shifting in its sleep deep beneath the earth. The teacups on the shelf would rattle with a soft, persistent chatter. The dogs would whine for no apparent reason, their ears flat against their heads. The islanders, attuned to every sigh and groan of their environment, noted it with a hunter's wariness, but life went on. The potatoes needed planting. Old man Lavarello, Gaetano's son, who remembered the stories of volcanoes from his Italian father, was the first to voice the deep-seated fear. The mountain, he would mutter, looking up at the cloud-shrouded peak. She is restless. Peter Green, his own bones feeling the strange vibrations, tried to reassure the community. It is the sea, he said, though he didn't fully believe it. A great storm far away, sending its shudders through the rock. But the tremors grew. From a faint chatter, they became distinct jolts that would make a man stumble. A crack appeared in the wall of the Rogers cottage, a thin, black line that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. Then the smell came. A faint, acrid taint of sulfur on the wind, the scent of matches and rotten eggs that no sea breeze could fully dispel. The birds, the island's constant, noisy companions, grew unsettled. The albatrosses circled higher, their plaintive cries taking on a new, frantic edge. The sheep in their stone folds huddled together, their bleating nervous. The meeting held to discuss the tremors was the most fearful in living memory. The practical, weather-beaten faces of the islanders were etched with a primal dread they had never known. The sea they could fight, the wind they could endure. But this was a threat from the very ground beneath their feet, the foundation of their world. "We must prepare the boats," John Green said, his voice tight. He was a father now, with a young son of his own. The abstract fear had become a visceral, terrifying reality. "And go where?" Sarah Green shot back, her arms wrapped around herself. "Into the roaring 40s in our longboats? That is a death sentence. Staying might be a death sentence too," another voice cried out. While they argued, the earth spoke again. This was not a tremor. It was a deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from the core of the planet. The ground lurched violently, throwing people from their feet. Crockery smashed on cottage floors. Outside, a section of the hillside above the settlement gave way, sending a cascade of rocks and mud into a potato patch with a sound like grinding teeth. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized the settlement. Children screamed. The stone bell, untouched, seemed to ring with the vibration. In that moment of chaos, Peter Green's authority solidified into something absolute. He stood, bracing himself against the doorframe as another, lesser shockwave passed through. "Enough!" he roared, his voice cutting through the bedlam. "John, Tommy, get every able-bodied man to the boats. Check every seam, every oar. Women pack. Food, water, warm clothes, the children's things. Nothing else. We must be ready to launch if the sea gives us a window." The orders were a lifeline. Action replaced paralysis. The community, trained by a lifetime of shared labor, snapped into a desperate, efficient routine. The men worked frantically at the water's edge, securing the longboats, loading barrels of fresh water and sacks of salted fish and bird meat. The women packed their most precious possessions, the family Bibles, the carved whalebone trinkets, the few photographs they owned, into sea chests, their hands trembling. For 2 days, they lived in this state of suspended animation, their world a shaking, groaning nightmare. The sky, once a clean Atlantic blue, was stained a dirty, yellowish gray. Ash began to fall, a fine, abrasive dust that coated everything and made breathing difficult. The mountain was no longer just restless, it was awake. Then, on the 3rd day, the sea provided their chance. The wind dropped, and the swell, while still formidable, lessened its fury. It was now or never. The evacuation was a scene of heartbreaking efficiency. The children, wide-eyed and silent, were passed into the boats. The elderly were carefully helped aboard. The Green family stood on the stony beach, taking a last look at their cottage, at the settlement they had built with their own hands. Smoke, not from a hearth, but from the earth itself, curled from fissures on the higher slopes. Peter placed a hand on the stone wall of his home, feeling its solidity, a solidity that had proven to be an illusion. "We built you well," he whispered, his voice thick. "But the earth is stronger." They rowed. They rowed until their arms felt like lead and their backs were on fire. They rowed until the island was a dark, smoking silhouette against the horizon. Only then did they risk a glance back. The utmost isle, their prison and their paradise, was vomiting its guts into the sky. They were alive, but they were exiles, afloat on the very element that had always been their greatest threat, refugees from the wrath of their own home. The 2 longboats, the Michael and David and the Faith, were pitifully small on the vast, heaving breast of the South Atlantic. They were life rafts carrying the entire population of a nation, over 250 souls, from mewling infants to the frail, ash-choked elderly. They had escaped the fire of the volcano, only to be delivered to the mercy of the sea. For 2 days and 2 nights they endured. The boats, designed for inshore fishing, wallowed dangerously in the ocean swells. The men took turns at the oars, not to make progress, but simply to keep the boats pointed into the waves, to prevent them from being swamped. The women bailed incessantly with gourds and buckets, their hands raw and bleeding. They shared their meager rations of water and salted bird meat, the children receiving the lion's share. Sleep was a fugitive state, snatched in fitful minutes between waves that crashed over the gunwales. It was the Trident, a British Royal Fleet auxiliary vessel on a South Atlantic patrol, that found them. The sight of the 2 tiny, overloaded boats in that immense seascape was one the crew would never forget. The Tristanians, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and fear, were hauled aboard with a tenderness that spoke of the miracle of their survival. The journey to England was a blur of surreal comfort and profound disorientation. The Tristanians, who had lived by candle and peat fire, were surrounded by electric light and the constant hum of engines. They slept in clean bunks, ate hot, prepared food, and were treated with a kindness that was both genuine and patronizing. They were celebrities, the volcano people, their stories splashed across the newspapers of the world. When they finally arrived in England, docking at Southampton, the culture shock was absolute. It was 1961, and the world they were thrust into was one of buzzing traffic, towering concrete buildings, and a frantic, impersonal pace of life that was the antithesis of their own. They were housed in a former Royal Air Force camp near Southampton, a place of bleak, identical barracks called Pendle Camp. The camp was their new, temporary island, but it was a prison of a different kind. The English weather was a damp, chilling cold that seeped into bones accustomed to the raw, but more consistent cold of the South Atlantic. The noise was constant and meaningless: the drone of aircraft, the blare of radios, the distant roar of motorways. The British government and the public were overwhelmingly generous. Donations of clothes, toys, and household goods poured in. But the gifts were often hilariously inappropriate miniature skirts for women who had never worn anything but long, practical dresses, complex board games for children who had invented their own games with stones and shells. The greatest struggle was the loss of purpose. On Tristan, every man and woman had a vital role, a clear, tangible contribution to the survival of all. Here they were idle, dependent. The men, masters of the sea and the land, were given meaningless tasks to keep them occupied. The community structure, the very bedrock of their identity, began to fray under the strain of welfare and inactivity. John Green, walking the perimeter of the camp fence, felt a despair deeper than any he had known on the stormy sea. He watched his son, little Peter, playing with a plastic toy lorry, his Tristanian accent already beginning to soften. He saw the young men of the island, his own nephews, drawn to the bright lights and fast life of Southampton, a life that promised everything and demanded nothing of their souls. "This will destroy us, Father," he said to Peter one evening, as they sat on their narrow camp beds. "Not the volcano. This." The old man, who had seemed to shrink in this alien environment, nodded slowly. "The world is too loud here, John. I cannot hear my own thoughts. I cannot hear us." They were safe. They were warm. They were fed. But they were dying, not in body, but in spirit. The exile shore was a comfortable beach, but it was eroding the very essence of who they were. The longing for their stark, demanding, and silent rock became a physical ache, a homesickness for a home that was, for all they knew, buried under ash and lava. They had survived the earth's fury, only to face the slow death of their culture. Pendle Camp was a cage of kindness. The food was plentiful, the beds were soft, and the English autumn, while damp, was not the biting, wind-lashed cold of Tristan winter. Yet, a malaise settled over the Tristanians, a collective depression that was as palpable as the camp's fog. It was the sickness of irrelevance. On Tristan, old man Lavarello's knowledge of how to read the weather and the flight of petrels was essential. Here, it was a quaint curiosity. On Tristan, Sarah Green's skill at weaving a watertight basket from tussock grass was a valued craft. Here, plastic buckets rendered it obsolete. The intricate social tapestry of the law of the common was unraveling in the face of individual welfare payments and the seductive anonymity of a modern society. The young were the first to adapt, and in adapting, they frightened their elders. Teenagers like Mary Green, John's daughter, traded their homemade jerseys for store-bought dresses, their Tristanian lilt for the latest English slang. They talked of staying, of finding jobs in factories, of a life beyond the rock. The world was big, and they wanted to see it. For the elders, every day was a fresh bereavement. Peter Green would spend hours staring at a single, treasured photograph of the settlement plain, the mountain a serene backdrop to the neat stone cottages. The sound he missed most was not the silence, but the sound of the community, the rhythmic chop of an axe, the distant call of a man coming in from the sea, the shared laughter from a neighboring cottage. The breaking point came during a meeting organized by well-meaning British officials. They presented plans for the Tristanians' permanent resettlement. There were offers of housing estates in England or farmland in South Africa. They spoke of integration and opportunity. Peter Green stood up. He was friendlier now, but when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 2 centuries of survival. "You are very kind," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "You have saved our lives. For that, we will always be grateful." He paused, looking around at the faces of his people, seeing the conflict and the longing in their eyes. "But you're asking us to stop being who we are. You offer us a house, but you cannot offer us a home. A home is not a building. It is the land you know. It is the people you belong to. It is the work of your hands that feeds your children." His voice grew stronger, filled with a passion they had not heard since the evacuation. "Our home is Tristan to Cunha. It is a rock. It is a hard place, but it is ours." He turned to the officials. "We do not want your integration. We want to go back." A murmur, then a swell of agreement, rose from the community. The young people looked at their parents and grandparents, seeing not backwardness, but a fierce, unbreakable love for their own way of life. The longing, which had been a private grief, became a public resolve. The British officials were flabbergasted. Go back? To a volcano? To a primitive existence? It seemed like madness. But they were facing not a plea, but a declaration. Scientific expeditions were sent to Tristan. The reports came back. The eruption was over. The main settlement, while covered in a layer of ash, was largely intact. The lava flow had missed it. The island was scarred, but it was habitable. The debate in Britain was fierce. Was it responsible to send them back? But the Tristanians were adamant. It was not a request. It was their decision. In 1963, 2 years after their traumatic exile, the first party of Tristanians boarded the ship that would take them home. As the English coastline faded, a weight seemed to lift from the community. They were going back. They were going to rebuild. John Green stood at the rail with his father. The old man's eyes were fixed on the southern horizon, a light in them that had been extinguished in England. "They thought we were poor on Tristan, John," Peter said softly. "But we were rich. We had everything that mattered. And now we were going to get it back." The exile was over. The longing was being replaced by determined hope. They were sailing home, not as victims, but as victors, returning to reclaim their kingdom of rock and sea. The ship that carried them home was not a vessel of rescue, but of restoration. The mood aboard was a stark contrast to the desperate, fearful exodus of 2 years prior. There was a quiet, electric tension, a mixture of trepidation and a fierce, almost holy anticipation. As the ship sailed south, leaving the temperate waters for the familiar chill of the South Atlantic, the Tristanians spent hours on deck, their eyes straining for the first sight of their mountain. When it finally appeared, a dark smudge on the horizon that resolved into the familiar, formidable peak, a collective gasp went through them. Then silence. The mountain was different. Its perfect cone was scarred, its flanks streaked with dark, alien flows of hardened lava. It was a wounded giant, but it stood. It had endured as they had. As they drew closer, the scale of the transformation became apparent. The lush green of the lower slopes was gone, buried under a uniform blanket of gray ash. The island looked dead, a ghost of its former self. The air, once rich with the smell of peat and salt, carried the faint, acrid taint of the eruption. The ship anchored in the same roadstead. The launch was lowered. The first to step ashore was Peter Green, supported by his son John. His boots crunched on a strange, new surface. The silence was profound. No birds cried. No sheep bleated. The settlement of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas lay before them, a village of ghosts. The stone cottages were still standing, but they were half buried in ash, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight. The potato patches were obliterated. It was a landscape from a nightmare. For a long moment, they simply stood there, overwhelmed by the desolation. The hope that had sustained them during the long exile wavered. Then Sarah Green, her face streaked with tears, bent down and scooped up a handful of the gray ash. She let it trickle through her fingers. "It's still our Earth," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "It's just sleeping." Her words were a spark. The paralysis broke. The law of the common, dormant in England, reawakened with a vengeance. There was no need for a meeting, no need for debate. They knew what to do. The work of resurrection began. It was harder than the original founding. Then, they had battled raw nature. Now, they battled nature's wrath. The men, their muscles softened by 2 years of idleness, attacked the ash with shovels and determination, digging out their cottages, their arms and backs screaming in protest. The ash got into everything: their clothes, their food, their lungs. It was a fine, abrasive dust that coated the world in monochrome. They found heartening signs. The stone walls of the cottages, built by their ancestors with such care, had held. The church bell, though muffled by ash, still hung in its tower. And then, a miracle. Tommy Rogers, digging near the stream, gave a shout. He held up a small, green shoot. A native plant, a tough, hardy fern, had pushed its way through the devastation. Life was returning. The work was organized with the old, familiar efficiency. Teams were formed. One group focused on making the cottages habitable, shoveling out the ash, repairing roofs with salvaged timber and new thatch. Another, led by John Green, worked on clearing the land for a new potato crop, mixing the fertile volcanic ash with the soil beneath. A third team, the fishermen, set about inspecting and repairing the longboats, which had survived, buried in a boat shed. Evenings were spent in a communal tent, their bodies aching, their spirits strangely lifted. The shared purpose, the tangible progress, was a balm. They were no longer refugees. They were pioneers again. They were writing the second chapter of their island's history. Weeks turned into months. A supply ship arrived, bringing tools, seed potatoes, and news from the outside world, which now felt more distant than ever. They learned that not everyone was returning. A handful of families, seduced by the comforts of England, had decided to stay. It was a quiet sorrow, but it reinforced the resolve of those who had come back. This was their choice. This was their fight. One evening, John stood with his father on the doorstep of their reclaimed cottage. A peat fire smoked inside, its familiar, earthy smell finally overpowering the scent of ash. The first, brave stars were appearing in the clear southern sky. "It will never be the same, Father," John said, his voice quiet. "No," Peter agreed, his old eyes scanning the settlement. The cottages stood clear of the ash now, smoke curling from their chimneys. The sound of children playing, a sound they had feared lost forever, echoed in the twilight. "It will be different. The mountain taught us that we do not own this rock. We are its guests. We must be humbler. But we're still here, John. We are still Tristanians." The return was more than just a physical journey. It was a reaffirmation. They had been offered the world and had chosen their rock. They had looked into the abyss of assimilation and had turned their backs on it. The island was scarred, and so were they. But as they planted their potatoes in the ashen-rich soil, they were not just planting food. They were planting a flag. They were home. The new rhythm of life on the resurrected Tristan was one of cautious optimism. The potato harvest that first year was small, but successful, a symbolic victory. The birds, tentatively at first, then in growing numbers, returned to the cliffs, their cries once again the soundtrack of the island. But a fundamental vulnerability remained. They were still utterly dependent on the whims of passing ships for everything they could not produce themselves: flour, sugar, metal goods, medicine. The solution came from the sea, but not in the way they expected. A South African fishing company, its vessels ranging further in search of the lucrative Tristan rock lobster, crayfish, made an offer. It was different from Mr. Biddle's proposal generations before. This time, the Tristanians would not be laborers, they would be partners. The company would provide a small, modern fishing vessel, the Georgetown, and a processing plant. The islanders would form a cooperative, the Tristan da Cunha Fishermen's Association, and they would own the catch. The company would handle marketing and export. The debate in the meeting hall was the most significant since the decision to return from exile. The ghost of Arthur Biddle hung in the air. "It is the same snake with different skin," argued old Benjamin Lavarello, the grandson of Gaetano. "They give us a boat, and soon they will tell us when to fish, how to fish. We will lose ourselves." But John Green, now the elected chief, saw a different future. "The world has found us, Benjamin. It is not 1890 anymore. We cannot hide. This is not about them taking over. This is about us taking control. We will own the boat. We will run the plant. We will decide. This is our chance to end our begging bowl existence." He held up a single, spiny crayfish, its shell a deep, ruddy orange. "This," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is our gold. Not to be mined by others, but to be harvested by us, for us. The money we earn will buy our freedom from dependency. It will pay for a doctor, for a teacher, for a generator. It will secure our future on our own terms." The vote was close, but the promise of self-sufficiency, of turning their greatest resource into tangible security, won the day. The Tristan da Cunha Development Company was formed. The arrival of the Georgetown was a revolution. It was a proper, seaworthy ship with a diesel engine, a wheelhouse, and a hold for the catch. The young men of the island, under the tutelage of a company skipper, learned to operate it, their traditional boat handling skills merging with modern technology. On shore, a simple, functional cannery was built. The whir of machinery was a new sound on Tristan, the smell of steam and cooked crayfish replacing the scent of peat and burr down in one corner of the settlement. The impact was immediate and profound. For the first time in their history, money flowed into the community. Not a fortune, but a steady, reliable income. They could now order supplies in bulk on their own schedule. They built a small power station, an electric light, a miracle they had only briefly known in England, began to glow in the cottage windows after dark. A permanent nurse was stationed on the island. A proper schoolhouse was constructed. The crayfish gold had bought them something priceless, a measure of control over their destiny. They were no longer passive victims of their isolation. They were managers of it. The outside world was now a customer, not a patron. The law of the common adapted. The profits from the crayfish were not distributed as individual wages, but were poured back into the community in an infrastructure, health care, and a fund for every child's education. John Green stood on the new concrete pier, watching the Georgetown unload its catch. He thought of his grandfather, Peter, who had feared the stranger's shadow. He hadn't been wrong to fear it, but John had learned that the shadow could not be avoided, only faced. By embracing the modern world on their own terms, by using its tools without surrendering their soul, they had ensured that the light of their community would continue to burn, a little brighter now, on the utmost isle. The crayfish money had brought light and power. The satellite dish brought the world. It was a stark, white parabola erected on a hill above the settlement, a technological flower pointing at a fixed point in the sky over the equator. With it came a telephone link and, most profoundly, television. The arrival of the first television set in the community hall was an event of awe and bewilderment. The entire population gathered as the technician fussed with the dials. A flicker, then a stable image. A British newsreader, his voice crisp and authoritative, speaking of events in places like Vietnam and London. The Tristanians watched, utterly silent, their faces illuminated by the alien, bluish glow. For the older generation, like John Green, now in his late 60s, it was a curiosity, a window to be glanced through occasionally. The flickering images of sitcoms and advertisements seemed ludicrous and irrelevant, a bizarre pantomime from a planet he had no desire to visit again. He preferred the solid reality of his potato patch, the tangible feel of a repaired net. But for the young, it was a siren song. His grandson, Liam, a teenager who had only known the post-volcano Tristan, was mesmerized. He saw a world of fast cars, fashionable clothes, and endless possibility. The slow, deliberate rhythms of island life, the patient wait for the mail ship, the communal potato harvest, the quiet evenings began to feel like a prison. The satellite signal beamed a constant, seductive message. There is more. This created the first true generational rift since the return. The elders saw the TV as a threat, a corrosive influence on the values that had sustained them for 150 years. The young saw it as a portal to the future, a right they were being denied. "Why should we be stuck here, Granddad?" Liam argued one evening, his voice passionate. "We have money now from the crayfish. I could go to Cape Town, study, see something of the world. And then what?" John replied, his voice calm but firm. "You become a speck in a city of millions. You will trade this." He gestured to the community outside the window, to the familiar face of the mountain, for a job in an office and a flat in a building. "This is who you are, Liam. This is your inheritance. It's your inheritance." Liam shot back. "I want my own." The tension was palpable. The shared purpose that had rebuilt the island was being tested by a new kind of isolation, not from the world, but from each other, fueled by the images from the satellite. The crisis came when two of Liam's friends, brothers from the Rogers family, announced they were leaving on the next supply ship to seek work in South Africa. Their parents were heartbroken but resigned. The community felt the loss deeply. It was a quiet hemorrhage, the slow draining of its future. John knew he could not command the young to stay. That would be a betrayal of the very freedom they had fought for. Instead, he called a meeting. He did not lecture. He asked a question. "The satellite shows us the world," he said, looking at the young faces in the room. "It shows us what we do not have. But I ask you, what does the world not have that we do?" He let the question hang in the air. "It does not have this," he continued softly. "It does not have a place where everyone knows your name, where no one ever needs to be lonely, where your success is everyone's success, and your sorrow is everyone's sorrow. The world out, there's a marketplace. This," he struck the floor with his foot, "is a family. Think carefully about what you are trading." The satellite dish was not removed. The TV signals continued to flow, but a new conversation had begun. The young people started to see their home not just through their own restless eyes, but through the wiser, more weathered eyes of their elders. They began to understand that the choice wasn't between a backward Tristan and an advanced world. It was a choice between two different kinds of wealth. The satellite had brought the world to their doorstep, and in doing so had forced them to decide, consciously, what they truly valued. The soul of Tristan was being tested, not by volcano or storm, but by the ghostly light of a television screen. The departure of the Rogers brothers was a quiet, somber affair. There was no celebration, only a gathering on the pier under a gray, drizzling sky. Their mother wept silently, clutching a handkerchief, while their father shook their hands with a grip that conveyed a lifetime of unspoken love and loss. The brothers, try to look brave and grown-up, boarded the supply ship with their single suitcases, their faces a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As the ship pulled away, its horn letting out a single, mournful blast, a piece of the community's heart seemed to tear loose and sail away with it. Liam Green watched from the hillside, his own resolve hardening. The sight of his friends leaving, of the palpable grief it caused, didn't deter him. It convinced him he was right. Staying was a choice to live in a museum, to be a custodian of a past that had no place for his dreams. He had to go. The confrontation with his grandfather, John, was inevitable. It happened in the potato patch, where so many of their important conversations had taken place. "The ship leaves in a month," Liam said, not looking at John, his eyes on the dark, fertile soil. "I've written to the college in Cape Town. They'll take me." John stopped his work, leaning on his spade. He felt a cold dread, colder than any winter gale. He saw the future in his grandson's determined face, a future where the island was a memory, a story told to disinterested children in a foreign land. "You have a place here, Liam," John said, his voice thick. "An important place. You're smart. You could run the fishing company one day. You could be chief." "And what would I be chief of?" Liam replied, finally meeting his gaze. "A community of old people, watching the young leave one by one. I don't want to preside over the end, Granddad. I want to be part of a beginning." The words were a physical blow. John had no answer. He saw the stark truth in them. The satellite dish had not just brought entertainment. It had brought a mirror, and the reflection showed a way of life perched on a precipice. The month passed in a strained silence in the Green household. Liam's mother, caught between her father and her son, moved through her days with a quiet sorrow. The community watched the drama unfold, knowing it was a microcosm of their own collective dilemma. The night before the ship was due, a strange, atmospheric fog rolled in, blanketing the settlement in a soft, sound-absorbing whiteness. The familiar world vanished, reduced to the ghostly shapes of the nearest cottages and the constant, damp breath of the sea. It felt like the island itself was holding its breath. Liam, unable to sleep, walked down to the water's edge. The pier was a phantom structure in the mist. He heard a footstep behind him. It was his grandfather. For a long time, they stood together in silence, 2 generations staring into the void. "I'm not leaving because I don't love it here," Liam said, his voice small in the fog. "I'm leaving because I love it too much to watch it die with me in it." John nodded slowly. He understood now. It wasn't rejection. It was a different kind of loyalty. A desperate, hopeful gamble that by engaging with the world, he might find a way to save the island from it. "I will not stand in your way, Liam," John said, the words costing him dearly. "A man must follow his own path. But know this rock will always be your home. No matter where you go, no matter what you become, this is your anchor. When you're tired, or when you're lost, you can always come back. The door will never be closed." He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, a gesture of blessing and release. The next morning, the fog had lifted. The sun shone on a clear, brilliant day. The goodbyes were less tearful this time, more resigned. Liam hugged his mother, shook his grandfather's hand, and boarded the ship. John stood on the pier long after the ship had disappeared, a solitary figure against the immense backdrop of the mountain. The leaving had happened. It felt like a failure. But as he turned and walked back towards the settlement, he saw the children playing, he saw the smoke rising from the crayfish factory, he saw the enduring, stubborn life of the community. The staying was a choice, too. A choice to believe that the old ways still had value, that the fire they kept burning was worth tending, even if the world outside saw only its smoke. The island would go on. It would be different, smaller perhaps, but it would endure. It had survived volcanoes and exile. It would survive the departure of its children, holding the light for them, just in case they ever needed to find their way home. With the exodus of the young, a new fear took root in the settlement, quieter than the volcano, but just as insidious: the fear of silence. Not the silence of the wind or the sea, but the silence of forgotten stories, of a language losing its voice. The Tristanian dialect, that unique fossil of 19th century English, was being smoothed away by the constant, polished tones of BBC English from the television and the returned letters from Cape Town in England. Alara Green, John's wife, felt this loss most acutely. A quiet, observant woman who had always been the community's unofficial archivist, she noticed the changes. The children no longer called a porch a stoop. The old words for different types of wind and wave were falling out of use. The intricate melodic lilt of the Tristanian accent was being replaced by something flatter, more global. She decided to fight back. Her weapon was a simple, lined notebook and a determined heart. She became the keeper of the word. She started with the oldest members of the community, the ones whose memories reached back before the volcano. She would visit them in their cottages, a pot of tea between them, and she would listen. "Tell me, Martha," she would say to the oldest Lavarello widow, "what did your mother call that little fern that grows by the stream?" Martha would close her eyes, her wrinkled face a map of the island itself. She called it fairy fingers, and a sudden squall from the south was a Cape Horner's kiss. Alara would write it down in her careful, looping script. She collected words for tools, for food, for feelings. She recorded the unique pronunciations, the dropped H's, the soft, almost Irish cadence that was their linguistic inheritance. She wrote down the old stories, not just the epic tales of the Blenworth and the volcano, but the small, everyday stories the time the sheep got into the potato patch, the legendary catch of crayfish in '58, the ghost story about the light seen on the peak of the mountain. She didn't stop there. She went to the schoolhouse, a bright, modern building paid for by crayfish money. She asked the young teacher, a woman from England on a 2-year contract, if she could have an hour a week. "What for?" the teacher asked, politely puzzled. "To teach the children where they come from," Alara replied. She stood before the small class of children, their faces bright and curious. She didn't lecture them. She told them stories. She told them about the first children on the island, who had to make their own toys from driftwood and whalebone. She taught them the old songs, the shanties that the fishermen used to sing as they rowed. She played games with them, using the old Tristanian words for hide and seek and tag. At first, the children were shy, giggling at the strange-sounding words. But slowly they were drawn in. The stories were about their own great-grandparents, about their own homes. The language was not a foreign thing. It was a secret code, a key to a hidden world that belonged to them. Alara's project became a community effort. The older men, who had been feeling obsolete, found a new purpose. They would visit the school and show the children how to carve a simple boat from a piece of driftwood, using the old names for the tools. The women taught them how to plait rope from tussock grass. John watched his wife, filled with a deep, proud love. She was not fighting the modern world. She was building a bridge between it and their past. She was ensuring that the soul of Tristan would not be washed away by the tide of progress. One evening, he found her in their cottage, her notebook open on the table. She was looking tired but content. "You are saving us, Alara," he said softly. She smiled, a rare, radiant smile. "No, John, I am just reminding us who we are. The world can have our crayfish. It can have our children for a while. But it cannot have our words. It cannot have our stories. Those are ours. And as long as we remember them, we will never be lost. The keeper of the word had ensured that even as the island changed, its heart would continue to beat in the rhythm of its own, unique language, a quiet, persistent song against the roar of the global sea. The 21st century arrived on Tristan da Cunha not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a fiber optic cable. The satellite dish was joined by a more robust internet connection, and the world, which had once been a distant image on a screen, suddenly became a place they could touch. The isolation that had defined them for 2 centuries was now, for the first time, optional. The impact was transformative. The schoolhouse, once limited to a handful of books, now had access to the entirety of human knowledge. A child could video call a cousin in England for help with their maths homework. The island's administrator could order medical supplies or spare part for the generator with a few clicks, ending the anxious wait for the quarterly supply ship. But the most profound change was for the exiles. Liam Green, now a man in his 30s living in Cape Town and working as a marine biologist, could now see his family every day. He would sit in his apartment and have a video call with his grandfather, John, who would hold up his tablet to the window to show him the weather on the mountain or the progress of the potato harvest. The aching distance was bridged by a stream of data. The Tristan da Cunha website and its accompanying social media pages became a window in the other direction. Alara, with help from a schoolteacher, began to post her collected stories and words online. She uploaded photographs of the old scrimshaw carvings, recordings of the bird cries, and videos of the annual potato planting. To their astonishment, the world was fascinated. They were no longer a forgotten curiosity. They were a global phenomenon, a living example of resilience and community. This global connection began to reverse the slow drain of the young. It created a new possibility. You could leave, get an education, see the world, and still remain connected, still contribute. Liam, using his expertise, began advising the Tristan Fishing Cooperative on sustainable practices via email. A young woman who had left to become a nurse video conferenced with the island's health worker to discuss a patient. The community, which had once feared the outside world as a predator, began to see it as a network, a wider version of their own community. They were no longer just the people of Tristan. They were the curators of a unique way of life, with a responsibility to share its lessons with a world that was increasingly fragmented and lonely. One day, a package arrived for John. It was from Liam. Inside was a modern, waterproof GPS device. There was a note for the boat's granddad. So you always know your way home, even in the fog. John held the device, its smooth plastic a world away from the sextant and the stars his ancestors had used. He thought of the long, terrifying journey in the longboats after the volcano, navigating by instinct and hope. This little box could have told them exactly where they were. He didn't see it as a rejection of the old ways. He saw it as their evolution. The stars were still there. The knowledge of the sea was still in their blood. But this was a new tool, a gift from grandson who had left but had never truly left. He walked down to the pier where the Georgetown was tied up. He handed the GPS to the young skipper. "Learn how to use this," he said, "but never forget how to read the water. Never forget how to feel the wind." The global village had come to the rock. It had not erased their identity. It had given them a new platform for it. They were still the people of the utmost isle, but now they could speak to the world, and the world, in turn, was listening. The circle of their community, once so tightly drawn, had expanded to encompass the entire globe, proving that you could be connected to everyone and still be uniquely, defiantly yourself. John Green felt the years not as a number, but as a weight in his bones, a familiar ache in his hands that had gripped so many oars and spades. He was the last living soul on Tristan who remembered the world before the volcano, the last direct link to the exile and the triumphant, arduous return. The community now looked to him not just as a former chief, but as the living memory of the island itself. He spent his days in a quiet rhythm, a slow, deliberate counterpoint to the digital buzz that now connected the settlement to the world. Each morning, he would walk his familiar circuit, past the crayfish factory with its hum of freezers, past the schoolhouse where children learned of a globalized world on sleek tablets, and out to the old potato patches. Here he would simply stand, his gnarled hand resting on a stone wall his grandfather had built, feeling the sun on his face and the enduring solidity of the rock beneath his feet. He was the anchor. In a world of change, he was the fixed point, the reminder of what truly mattered. The young people, even those who had chosen to stay, saw the world through a lens of possibility. John saw it through a lens of permanence. He knew that factories could fail, that internet cables could break, that global markets for crayfish could collapse. But he also knew that the potato would always grow in this soil if you tended it, that the birds would always return to the cliffs, and that the community would always find a way if it held together. His grandson, Liam, had become the sail. From his office in Cape Town, he harnessed the winds of the global economy for the island's benefit. He had secured a geographical indicator status for the Tristan rock lobster, making it a premium branded product. He brokered deals that brought in a steady stream of scientists and a small number of volunteerists, whose fees helped fund the infrastructure. He was the island's face to the world, articulate, modern, and fiercely protective of his heritage. Their weekly video calls were a meeting of two epics. John, in his simple cottage, and Liam, in his high-rise apartment, would talk. "The new desalination plant is fully funded, Granddad," Liam would say, his face bright on the screen. "In a year, you'll have all the fresh water you need, no matter the drought." John would nod. "A good thing. But remember, Liam, the old catchment tanks still work. They're a good backup. Never rely on just one string for your net." Liam had learned to listen to this wisdom. He no longer saw it as resistance to progress, but as the application of a deeper, older logic, the logic of survival. He had come to understand that his grandfather's conservatism was not fear, but a profound and hard-won prudence. The true test of this new balance between the anchor and the sail came when a major international corporation, seeing the PR value, offered a small fortune to film a reality television show on the island. The offer was tempting. It would solve their financial needs for a generation. The community meeting was divided. The money was undeniable. But John, who had seen the distorting effect of the first television, stood slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "They will not see us," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. "They will see a story they want to tell. They will make a drama from our peace, a conflict from our harmony. They will turn our lives into a spectacle. We survived the volcano to protect our way of life. Will we now sell it for a brighter light in our cottages?" Liam, on a video link from Cape Town, spoke next. "Granddad is right," he said, to the surprise of many. "Our value is in our authenticity. If we become a TV set, we lose that. Our brand is our truth. We say no." The offer was declined. It was a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation before, when poverty was a constant companion. But now, confident in their managed connection to the world, they could afford to say no. They had chosen their soul over a shortcut. After the meeting, John walked down to the shore. The Georgetown was coming in, its hold full of crayfish that would be flown to gourmet restaurants in Europe and America. It was a scene that connected the old world to the new, the timeless sea, the modern boat, the timeless community, the global market. He was the anchor, holding fast to the bedrock of their identity. Liam was the sail, catching the winds of opportunity to carry them forward. One was useless without the other. The anchor without a sail was stagnation. The sail without an anchor was a ship lost at sea. Together, they were navigating the future, ensuring that the fragile, beautiful vessel of Tristan de Cunha would not just survive the 21st century, but would sail through it with its purpose and its soul intact. The winter gales had begun their annual siege, but inside John Green's cottage, the air was warm and still, fragrant with the smell of peat smoke and the faint, briny scent of the sea that always lingered. The end, when it came, was not a surprise. It was a slow, gentle ebbing, like the tide retreating from a familiar shore. The whole island knew, and a quiet vigil began. They came not in a crowd, but in ones and twos, respecting the silence. The young skipper of the Georgetown came and sat for an hour, saying nothing, just sharing the space. Alara, her own hair now white, held her husband's hand, her love a steady, warm presence. The children from the school, guided by their teacher, brought drawings of the mountain and the boats, taping them to the cottage wall where he could see them. John was floating in a calm sea of memory. The faces around him blurred with the faces of the past: his father, Peter, standing firm against the volcano, his grandfather, William Glass, the founder, a figure of mythic determination. He could hear the crack of the Blendworth on the rocks, the terrifying roar of the earth, the joyful shouts of the return. He had been the bridge. He had carried the story from the age of sail to the age of the internet. On the other side of the world, Liam sat in the dark of his Cape Town apartment, his laptop open, connected by a live video feed. He watched the comings and goings in the cottage, the simple, profound rituals of a community caring for its own. He saw the anchor holding fast to the end. As dusk settled over the settlement plain, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange, John's breathing grew softer. Alara leaned close. "The children's pictures are beautiful, John," she whispered. "The Georgetown is in safe hands. Liam is watching. We are all here. The light is on." A faint smile touched his lips. He was back on the pier, a young man, watching the ship that carried his friends away. He was in a longboat, his muscles burning, rowing away from the burning island. He was standing in the ashes, the taste of despair in his mouth, deciding to rebuild. He had seen it all. He had been the keeper of the story. His last thought was not of an ending, but of a continuous line. The story did not end with him. It was being carried by Alara and her notebooks, by the young skipper on the boat, by the children who drew pictures of their home, by Liam, the sail, in a distant city. The light was not going out. It was being passed on. In the cottage, the silence deepened, filled only with the soft crackle of the peat and the eternal sigh of the wind. The last light on the mountain, the living memory of old Tristan, had gone out. But as the stars emerged, sharp and brilliant in the clear, cold air above the utmost aisle, a new light was being lit in the schoolhouse, where a child was writing a story that began, "My island is the most remote in the world, and this is its story." The circle was unbroken. A single light burns in the administrator's office, a pinprick of human presence in the vast, dark expanse of the South Atlantic. The satellite dish on the hill silently streams data out into the cosmos and receives it back. In the cottages, families watch a film downloaded from the internet, while in another, an elder tells a child a story about the great volcano, her voice using words that exist nowhere else on Earth. The Georgetown rests at its mooring, ready to harvest the crayfish that fund this modern life. The stone bell hangs silent, a monument to a quieter time. The graves of the founders are tended, their names spoken with reverence. The mountain stands guard, its slopes green again, a dormant but watchful giant. Tristan, Cunha is no longer the forgotten place on the map. It is a beacon. It is a testament to the power of community, a living lesson in resilience. It proves that it is possible to embrace the future without surrendering the past, to be connected to the world without being consumed by it. The people of the Rock have learned the ultimate secret of survival, that their greatest strength was never their isolation, but their unity. And as long as that fire is tended, as long as the story is told, the utmost I will endure, a tiny steadfast world in a sea of change, forever home to the most remote community on Earth.